Ministering the word. Okay, a lot of churches think the pastor should have many PhDs and come in with a sermon that is the 5 S's of success. And they should flip around their Bibles from this part, put together all this kind of stuff to come up with a message that woes people, wows them. That, brother, sister, is flesh. That is all flesh. If you read Scripture, Jesus is there. He will teach it. You don't have to add to what he's doing. You don't have to do anything special. In the early church, Christians were persecuted. They would congregate in a dark place where nobody could see them, and somebody would pull out of their shirt a letter that Paul wrote, and they would just read it. And maybe they would talk. What did Paul mean when he said that? They would just read the letter. And maybe that was the only letter they had. Maybe they had one letter and then they took it and sent it to another church. And they just talked about what Paul wrote for weeks afterwards. You don't have to have a special thing. You can just read the Bible. And it would also help if you memorize the Bible. That way, they used to do that too. Like somebody would memorize parts of Paul's letter, and then they would pass the scrolls to another church, but they would still be able to recite it and listen to, at their service. So there might be, Sister A who recited the chapter 1 of Paul's letter, and Brother B had chapter 2, and they would go on like that. But you want to read the scriptures. You don't want pastors who are going to talk about themselves or their wives or what they had for dinner or their daughters or what other pastors said about them or what pastor got a new jet and they didn't get one or what conference they were invited to. You don't want them talking about what their CDs are, their new series, and you can buy this tape and buy that tape, and you can go to the seminar and you can check them out on TV and station and all this stuff. That is all flesh. When people talk about their own lives, the pastors talk about their own lives, that is flesh. Pastors are servants of God. And in fact, I use the term loosely when I say a pastor, because you know what I mean. You mean somebody standing up giving the word. It doesn't have to be a pastor. It could be anybody. It could be it has to be someone who's a mature Christian who understands something. But if you understand something and if you know how to read, you could read it out and explain what it means. You don't have to have gone to seminary to do that. It's not necessary. In fact, most seminaries teach you the wrong things anyhow. Also, in your church, listening, you're going to have new people who just came in off the street who don't know anything, and you're going to have children who are growing up, and you have to be able to not get totally advanced in your theology and just talk about what the scripture says. Read a parable that Jesus gave, explain it to them. You don't really need to get too much. Anything else gets in the way. The church that I used to go to, you weren't allowed to say anything about your life. You cannot say, oh, my name is Joseph Lotto and I got a PhD. And you couldn't say that. You can't say what you had for breakfast. You can't say who your wife is. You can't have your kids get up and introduce them. You can't say where you live or anything. You can only talk about what the scripture says, what Jesus said, what David said, what Paul wrote. Those are the kinds of things you can talk about. You can talk about Old Testament too. You can talk about Moses, Elijah, but you can't talk about yourself. Nobody cares about yourself. Stop feeding your own ego, pastors. Talk about Jesus. He is the only one who's special. He's the only one who is worth hearing about. Everything else you tell, these stories, and that reminds me about the time when I did this, and that reminds me. Those are great stories the first time you hear them. They're great stories the second time you hear them. They're great stories the third time you hear them. They are not great stories 500 times later. Nobody wants to hear your stories. They want to hear Jesus. They came to church to meet Jesus. So talk about him. Focus on the Lord.